Thank you for joining the DIGGY show, Simina. How are you doing?
Thank you for inviting me. I'm doing well, thank you.
Thank you. So let's jump to the topic. It's about Uyghurs. So I came across your article on Pocket App. So I thought just to reach you out and ask you regarding Uyghurs and what's their situation. So can you just explain me briefly, like who are Uyghurs, their origin, religion, language, food, culture, in brief, like so that people who are watching this video, they get to know like about whom we are talking.
Sure. So Uyghurs are an ethnic minority who live in China's Xinjiang region. This is a region in China's far west, bordering Kazakhstan. And there are about 11 million Uyghurs currently living in Xinjiang. And they are a majority Muslim population, though not everyone is Muslim. And they historically have a separate cultural identity from China's majority population, which is the Han Chinese.
Oh, yeah. So I just wanted to ask, like, was it an independent land before 1949? So when the China got independence and stuff, Mao started to rule over there. So was it an independent land, just like Tibet? Or
so it was briefly independent. It was briefly independent in the 20th century. But Xinjiang's history goes like further back. It was, I believe it was incorporated into China during the Ming Dynasty, when there were a lot of regional wars in what now we know as being China. But the Chinese government claims that Xinjiang has been part of China for thousands of years. Some of those claims are being disputed, like they also claim that the South China Sea has been part of China for thousands of years. The point is that Xinjiang was briefly independent in the 20th century, and then it was occupied, invaded again by Mao, by the People's Liberation Army. A lot of people in Xinjiang refer to that period when the region was called East Turkestan. They still refer to Xinjiang now as East Turkestan.
yeah. So
but China considers that name as a form of separatism, so it strongly opposes it.
Definitely. So I just wanted to ask, like, who do they consider their culture very close to which countries in Central Asia? Whether it's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, who are they very close to in terms of culture, food, music?
So their language is a Turkic language. Yeah. So they're culturally closer to some like Middle Eastern, Central Asian nations than they are to China. Okay. For example, one of the closest, from what I understand, the closest language to the Uyghur language is Uzbek. Someone in Central Asia, yes.
Oh wow.
And culturally, also, it is closer to those like Central Asian countries.
More of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, everything, right?
Yeah, the stands and Turkey.
So I just wanted to ask, like China always had kind of they always wanted a piece of land, just like they wanted with Tibet. Why they want Xinjiang to be associated with China? Like why? Like in terms of business, is it like because of China-Pakistan economic corridor, the CPEC stuff happening, the Silk Route stuff? Like, can you tell me?
So Xinjiang is supposed to be a very important region in Chinese President Xi Jinping's plan to revitalize the Silk Road, the ancient Silk Road. The new program is called Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah. And it's supposed to, China wants to create all these infrastructure routes connecting it to countries in Europe and Africa, the Middle East, everywhere. And Xinjiang is an important route in in this plan. Like, for example, Kashgar is supposed to be one node in the China-Pakistan corridor, economic corridor, like you mentioned, and that these plans are central to China's security, like economic security, because the China-Pakistan corridor is seen as an alternative to the Malacca Strait that could be potentially blocked, and that where resources such as oil can arrive in China.
Oh,
So
wow.
it is very important for Beijing to have Xinjiang be stable and like easily incorporated into these plans.
Oh, so I just wanted to ask one thing. Like, if there's a lot of business coming into that place, a lot of people would get jobs, but still, people of Xinjiang, mostly Uyghurs, why would they have any problem if China would be bringing so much business into that place, so much economic boost will be happening over there? Why don't they be a part of, they take it as a part of China? Why
So
it's not happening smoothly?
theoretically, there should be. So theoretically, there should be economic development. Uh, China has, for a long time, had a policy of trying to resettle Han Chinese, the majority, the ethnic majority, uh, in Western regions of China, which were mostly populated by ethnic minorities. So it's incentivized people to move to Xinjiang, for example, and take jobs there and settle down there. But throughout this whole, like the past like few decades, Xinjiang people have felt partly left out. Like Uyghurs and Kazakhs, the ethnic minority people, have felt partly left out of these opportunities that they felt benefited the Han Chinese more.
Oh. So they're
So
not.
it's there's economic development, but it doesn't benefit everyone equally.
Oh, it's happening only for the Han Chinese, you mean to say? Yeah.
Mostly,
Yeah.
yes.
So this uh, attack on their religion, attack on their identity, kind of cultural genocide, is it happening? Is it a new phenomena, or is it happening since 1949? And if it's happening since 1949, like how it was done in 50s, 60s, and 70s up till now, when we compare it with Xi Jinping's administration?
So for a long time, um, there's been, like, you've probably heard of China's one-child policy
Oh, yeah.
that was like implemented 40 years ago and then discontinued in 2016. Um, and that limited each family's right to children, to having just one child.
Yeah.
And during those times, ethnic minorities actually benefited from exceptions, like they could have more children. Also, people who lived in rural areas, that applied also to them, and they also could. So there were some incentives geared at ethnic minorities. Like, for example, they could more easily access higher education. Like they would get extra points on the Gaokao, the university entrance exam that all the Chinese students take at the end of high school, and then that decides whether or not they can go to university and to our university. So uh, ethnic minorities would get extra points so that they would have better chances at entering and getting studies. But since there have been a few incidents. Um, there was there were riots in 2009 in Urumqi, ethnic riots
Yeah.
that were sparked by an event that took place far away from Xinjiang. There were China had this program where they were placing Xinjiang people in other provinces so they could work there. So there were a group of Uyghur workers at a factory in Guangdong province, which is a very southern, it's a southern province bordering Hong Kong, so very far away from Xinjiang. And one of the workers, or several of the workers, were accused of raping a Han Chinese woman, and apparently the claims were unfounded. But the result of that was that some Uyghur workers were killed by Han Chinese. So then this event that happened in Guangdong province sparked protests in Urumqi, which is the capital of Xinjiang. And there was a violent crackdown on the protests. And that's when, that was like a turning point in China's handling of Xinjiang.
Oh,
And then over the past decade, there were gradual restrictions on Uyghurs' way of life. For example, having beards was considered breaking the law, was like it became outside of the law a few years ago, or wearing veils for women. And then everything intensified, like the crackdown intensified in 2016 when a new Communist Party leader was put in charge of Xinjiang. His name is Chen Chuangguo, and he used to rule Tibet, which is again another Chinese region known for being like enclosed, and there's no access, there's no like easy outside access to Tibet. So he was moved from Tibet to be in charge of Xinjiang, and he apparently designed the system of like mass incarceration of Uyghur people.
oh, so
And
he was.
starting in 2017, yes, Xinjiang started building these internment camps where now there have been an estimated like more than 1 million people that have like rolled through these camps. And people have been put in camps for all sorts of reasons that like seem arbitrary, such as if they traveled abroad, or if they had WhatsApp installed on their phones, or if they have relatives abroad, or if they had a prayer rug or a Quran at home,
So
or if they ever like went to the Saudi Arabia, the Hajj pilgrimage.
okay,
Yes.
if they have been there. So I was just coming to this point because, as you mentioned, that guy who was handling Tibet came to Xinjiang, and after that, there was a lot of mass incarcerations. So after that, that labor camps, detention centers emerged. Can you just explain me like what happens inside those labor camps slash detention centers slash vocational training centers? So can you explain me the layers, different groups, who goes where, and how do they spot that this person might go to labor camp or education training center, anything, some sort of this way?
So I've interviewed at this point probably more than 100, both like Xinjiang camp survivors and family members. And there are commonalities in their stories. There are like similarities. And basically what often happens is that people are put in the camps for various reasons. I don't know. So one category, because we were mentioning the attempt to decapitate the culture, the Uyghur culture. One category of people that were placed in the camps were cultural elites. For example, university professors, writers, authors,
Islamic
researchers.
scholars.
Islamic scholars, like people who had been appreciated by the culture, people who had even received like awards from the government, or who had worked for the Chinese government. They were all placed in camps. And then a lot of regular people who again were accused of like having banned apps on their phones, which is not something that Han Chinese people get punished for, right? I mean, these apps, the Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., are not accessible here, but it's not illegal to own a VPN, or it's not illegal to have WhatsApp on your phone. But for for Xinjiang people. Like that became a reason why they were placed in the camps. Other people were like, there have been reports recently of people being placed there for having had too many children.
Yeah.
Even though ethnic minorities used to be allowed to have up to 3 children, but now, like in various areas of Xinjiang, they've been placed in camps for that reason, for praying, for being imams at mosques, even though a lot of them were government approved imams, they were still like gathered and placed in camps.
Yeah. So I just came across one article where they said like after 2000 there was an increase in I would say Salafism, kind of the other kind of Wahhabism, where there are a lot of, they're very fanatic in terms of religion, and that is something which is against Communist Party, that you cannot be too religious, right? Do you understand? So do you think this might have
Yeah.
been the reason where they were taking all the elites and incarcerating them?
So there have been so-called terrorist incidents
Yeah.
in the past, let's say 20 years. There were the riots that I mentioned in 2009. In the 2000s, there were also a couple of, there was an attack in Beijing that was blamed on Uyghurs, and there was an attack in Kunming, which is a city in South China.
South China.
But these attacks were isolated. So the Chinese government has used them as a reason to crack down on Uyghurs and on their religion. There have been Uyghurs who have joined radical terrorist organizations in Syria, for example. Like that has been documented. Like for the promise that one day those organizations in Syria, for example, will help them attack China, which is hard to imagine.
Yeah.
So there have been cases of extremism.
That's what I want.
But again, that's not necessarily a legitimate reason to place the whole population.
No, that's definitely, I do agree. But there might have been a lot of money laundering which might be coming into the China from all these sorts of Al Qaeda, ISIS, ISIL, everything. These kind of. That's how.
I don't know. I've never seen like proof of that necessarily.
Okay, so it was more.
Or I've never seen like credible reports of like huge amounts of money coming into China from terrorist organizations. The Chinese have a very tight control over like the banking system. Oh. They see and control all the money that goes in. Like for example, I interviewed someone who returned. She lived in the U.S. and her family in Xinjiang helped her pay her mortgage at one point and lend her $10,000. And then a year later, she returned the money, and then the government found that these people in Xinjiang received $10,000 from America, and they put them into camps. But it was like a family, gesture.
I understand. I understand.
So they have very strict controls over the banking system.
Over the banking. So it is more of a homegrown anti-establishment, right? Where they are more of a homegrown, more of a people who are involved in this. They are kind of grown, nurtured in Xinjiang to attack in places like Kunming, Beijing, where you mentioned before.
I think so, but again, these cases have been pretty isolated.
Okay.
So it's not. I never got the impression that Xinjiang was like a cradle of terrorism or anything like that. Like there hasn't been like a large terrorist organization like Al Qaeda or ISIS or anything like that. It's been like there've been isolated incidents.
Yeah. So I was watching this documentary. I don't remember the name or where I watched it, but it's been like a year and a half. I was watching this, how well built the system is. The people who are keeping the eyes on, who are inside the camps, or even who are outside, normal people. So can you tell me, like, how well built is the system? How the Chinese government is
The
keeping it?
surveillance.
Yeah, the surveillance system, both inside and outside.
Outside the camps or outside Xinjiang?
Outside the camps and inside the camps in Xinjiang.
So yeah, so basically inside the camps there's surveillance everywhere. Like I've interviewed people who have told me that there were cameras in the showers, in the toilets, and there's absolutely no privacy. In Xinjiang on the streets there are frequent checkpoints. It depends on what part of Xinjiang. Surveillance is stricter in the south of Xinjiang, where the percentage of ethnic minorities is higher than in the north of Xinjiang. But there's surveillance everywhere. So there are frequent checkpoints where people from ethnic minorities have to go and have go through these face check. Face recognition. Yeah, facial recognition, and they have to scan their IDs, and they're very frequent. Like for example, in Kashgar, in the southern part of Xinjiang, there were like, let's say if you moved around in one day, you probably had to go through 20 or 30 such checks, and they only apply to Uyghurs. So for example, we were on a bus at one point, and we were passing through one of these checkpoints, and all the Han Chinese were allowed to sit on the bus and wait while all the Uyghurs had to go through these checkpoints. So it doesn't apply to everyone. It's just the Uyghurs who are monitored like that. And there's yes, and there's they also have these apps that and these devices that scan people's phones to see if there are any prohibited apps downloaded. They also, of course, China has, and the Chinese government has access to the usual apps that people use here, like WeChat, for example.
I do understand. So even in India, the government actually banned 59 apps.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, the Chinese apps. Do you think it's a good move, or what's your take on it? I'm going out of the topic right now, but what's your take? Like,
I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, I've seen proof, like in my reporting, and in my reporting that WeChat is not a safe app. I don't ever use it anymore in my contact with my sources. At the same time, there are these like Chinese technology companies that try to become global, like TikTok, or Huawei. That's like a different story. And they're no matter how much they try to separate themselves from these assumptions that they are controlled by the Chinese government, I think they're not succeeding in doing that. But at the same time, I don't know if these claims are true or not. I mean, we know there's like, I know that TikTok has tried to separate its international version from the local one that's like censored and everything. But as long as they're a Chinese company, there will always be the suspicion against them. So I don't know.
Yeah. So the way you just gave me an idea about the dystopian world, the Xinjiang province, which you said there's so much surveillance camera, a person who just went on a walk, who might be going out on a walk or doing some groceries, he or she might have to go through like 20 facial recognition checkpoints, right? So that is something which is very different, which is dystopian. That does not happen in normal world. So if I live in Toronto, can you explain me with example where you might have traveled abroad, cities like Toronto or New York, London, if you compare it with Xinjiang? So it's a complete different. Can you just give a little bit contrast So the people who
Yeah,
might,
so
yeah,
in other cities around the world, and even in other cities in China, you can move around freely, you can go shopping, you can enter a market without having to go through metal detector uh, machines, without having to go through facial recognition devices, without having to have your whole body scanned in one of those like things that are similar to the ones you have at the airport.
yeah,
We saw a lot of machinery made by the same companies that make airport security devices, and they're just like so widespread across Xinjiang. There's it's I can't imagine how business can prosper in a place like that, where even to move from point A to point B, you have to stop so many times and you're checked so many times.
yeah, completely
So
understand.
it's completely different from the rest of China. It's like a different world.
So,
That's not the case here in Beijing or in Shanghai or in Guangzhou.
so as a tourist, if I go to Xinjiang, I might be stopped a lot of times for my passport check, for my ID check.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
Yes, and you have to show your passport every time, and then they write down the data in your passport, and then they interrogate you. And then if you're a journalist, you get followed. You're followed the whole time by sometimes a large group of state security uh, personnel. Like we were followed. I was there with two colleagues, and we were followed by up to 8 state security agents at a time. They were always like right behind us. And I mean, we didn't try to talk to people because we knew we risked getting the people into trouble. But let's say if we were at a market, at a bazaar, and we wanted to like buy fruit, like they would be right there, like step between us and the people in Xinjiang, and prohibit us from talking, basically.
so it means like there are a lot of military police personnel, in fact, and there are a lot of agents who keeps an eye on the city. So, so
Yeah, so there are a lot of people in uniforms, like security and police, and there's also like these people, the state security who were following us, were in normal, regular clothes. But
yeah, I understand. I was watching this documentary on Vice. Maybe if you've watched it or not, there was this reporter from
I've seen it.
the British reporter who came
Yeah,
to.
I've seen it.
She went to Xinjiang, and there was a constant. There was a person who was following her and her friend for about like 5 to 6 days. The time she was there.
Yes.
So can you tell me about Han colonization?
Sorry.
Can you tell me about Han colonization? How does people from other part of China who are Han Chinese, they come into
Mhm.
Xinjiang, and how they kind of destroy the social structure, communal harmony of Uyghurs? Like, how do they impact their lives? So for me, in India, like
Mhm.
it's kind of very diverse country. So if someone who goes from
Mhm.
one part of the India to another part of India, that's not a big issue, barring few of such incidents. But someone going from the other part of China, the Han Chinese going in Xinjiang, how does it destroy someone's uh, harmony, culture? Can you tell me something about it?
What I heard a lot from people from Xinjiang is that there didn't used to be any problems, or there didn't used to be any serious problems until all of these government policies were rolled out. That these very strict policies against the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs, like people used to live together in peace.
Oh,
That's what I hear a lot of. It's like there was no problem. Like the problem was created by these policies.
roughly around when these policies were introduced, around after 2009, you said?
A lot of them, yes, after 2009. Like I've had people who have told me that they never like both like Uyghurs, for example, said like we never felt like we were on separate teams, or like that we were pitted against each other
Yeah, I understand.
until that point. And like we had, there were like people saying that I had friends who were Han Chinese at work, And after the 2009 incident, everything became very strange, and these friendships like stopped existing. Or I've had, on the other hand, I have, for example, a Hui friend. Hui is another ethnic minority, and they're also Muslim. And she said, "Well, I didn't think the Uyghurs were against us." That's what she said. So the perception after those riots was that they are against each other, which was something that did not exist, at least not to the same extent before.
2009.
And then and then as the more these restrictive policies were rolled out, the more difficult the situation became.
Yeah.
And now Xinjiang, I mean, I was there last in the winter at the end of 2018, so that's a year and a half ago. It's basically looks like a shell of what it used to be. Like there were so many areas that were empty, in like Uyghur neighborhoods. There were like night bazaars that were empty basically, and it's not, I mean, the government likes to put on this display of like cultural vibrancy. Like they have this historic center in Kashgar, for example, and they have Uyghurs dressed up in their traditional clothes and wearing costumes and like dancing and singing and putting on a show. But the same people, if they did these things in the intimacy of their homes, could be punished for it.
Okay.
So it's like this facade that the government tries to.
So yes, like something happened after 2009 with the policies. How did like the Communist Party, they pitted Han Chinese against Uyghurs and other minorities? How systematically and strategically they used them? Any idea?
So there used to be, I interviewed some like historians, like Xinjiang policy historians, and one of them told me that China used to have this policy like ever since the 80s of their 56 ethnic minorities, 55 plus the Han, and they were seen as the building blocks of Chinese culture. So like everyone was integrated in this like great China. But that has started to shift after Xi Jinping came to power, the president came to power in 2012, so 2013. And the party started pushing for a more assimilationist approach, where now the view is that the Han culture, the Chinese culture, is the root of everything else. So there's no like separate identities. There's the China identity, and everything needs to be incorporated into that.
Everything has to be under the China. There should not be anyone who believes in something else, who prays some god, some different god.
Yes,
I understand. Yeah. So this is how they actually they kind of did a cultural or a religious genocide apart.
Yes.
Mass incarcerating people. Yeah. So
yes, and now they're not even like, people used to have their ethnic minorities listed on their ID, like your Uyghur or Hui or whatever, and that's stopped. So now everyone's Chinese officially.
I understand. So if, for example,
so even that, yeah, and there's the president Xi Jinping has also pushed for a stronger hand in an iron fist in Xinjiang. Like he said, he wanted to surround Xinjiang with an iron fence. Like this was around 2014. So this is whole like a policy that started from the top and has been implemented by these other people, Chen Chongguo and the rest. And you mentioned, sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll add after that. You go on.
You mentioned that the Chinese government is being accused of cultural genocide, but they are also more recently have been accused of genocide per se, of like committing genocide, because there was a report last month that came out from a very well-known researcher, German researcher, Adrian Zenz that show that there has been a drive to reduce birth rates in Xinjiang among Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, and there's been like mass sterilization of women and mass like implantation of IUDs and other contraceptive devices. And there've been a lot of reports, even people whom I interviewed, women whom I interviewed, who talked about like receiving shots in their arms when they were in the camp, and like they're not getting their periods, and they found out they were sterilized. So there are like the accusations against the government over Xinjiang are becoming more and more serious.
I understand. So I was just coming to this point where I wanted to talk about how they were destroying the family structure by giving sterilization to women. And so before that, I just wanted to say, like, the policies which you were mentioning before, if you have if you have links to it, where what policies changed happened after 2009, I would really like to share it over here, because right, if you can just email me or you can send it to me on Twitter, so that it will be helpful for people who will be watching it. Yeah,
sounds good.
Yeah. So coming back to the family structure, where how they destroyed it with the contraceptive devices. Similar thing they did when they wanted one child policy, kind of thing. Can you compare these two incidents and explain briefly, like, what is this?
Yeah, so I was reading an article by an author who wrote a book about One China policy, and she said, her name is Mei Feng, and she said that the one child policy was always about control, like the Communist Party's control over the population, and it's the same now in Xinjiang. Like they have decided that this minority that appeared problematic to them needs to be assimilated, needs to be made into Han, and they're doing this in various ways. There's a program where Han Chinese officials are sent to live in the homes of Uyghurs. So for example, let's say the father of the family is sent to camp, and then this Han Chinese man comes in and has to live with the woman and the children. And then everybody needs to eat pork and drink alcohol and do all these things that like Muslim people would not want to do because of their religion. And the children are interrogated. They're like, do your parents speak Uyghur at home? Do your parents pray at home? And then if they say yes, they do, then the parents go to camp. The children are being, if both parents are placed in camps, children are being put into these boarding schools, so-called boarding schools, where they are taught Han Chinese, and they are like being raised as Han people. Like they don't have access to Uyghur language or culture or anything like that. And then these reports of like sterilization are very serious. They're trying to reduce the number of Uyghur people, of Uyghur children. So that's problematic.
So I just wanted to add.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a point over here. So I was reading a report where they said in China they had birth quotas, where they said like Han people can have these many children if they are living in rural or urban. Same goes with minorities. But they said like there have been reports that Uyghurs have been flouting their birth quotas. They have been going above that, mostly because of their religious inclination. Can this be a reason why Communist Party is going hard on Uyghurs?
So there was like some Communist Party official who said a few. Oh, no, it was Xi. Sorry, I'm just checking my notes. Xi Jinping in 2014 called for equal family planning policies. So he wanted ethnic minorities and Han Chinese to have the same requirements. So while like I was mentioning toward the beginning of our talk, years ago, ethnic minorities used to benefit from exemptions from some of these rules, and they were they got better chances at like pursuing higher education and stuff like that. I think that has reverted now, because now Han Chinese are encouraged to have more children, because the Chinese government has realized that there will be a lot of strain on the social security system because the population is getting older, etc., etc. Whereas it's the situation is reversing for the Uyghurs. Like they are now the center of these policies, these restrictions. And I think the understanding is that when it happened, that when the one child policy was applied to Han Chinese, it was for mainly economic reasons. Like the Communist Party believed that the country needed to grow its population more slowly in order to be more prosperous, and to lift people out of poverty, which has happened. They've accomplished that to a great extent, but in the case of Uyghurs, this appears to be cultural and like ethnic. It's related to their identity as an ethnic minority that needs to be reduced in some way, or like their vitality needs to be reduced.
So that's how they are actually have sterilization programs. They have a lot of camps where people have been taken to the camps. Women have been taken to the camps. They have been given some kind of medicine stuff, so they are skipping their period, right?
Yes.
Wow. So can you tell me, like, what's the general idea or general behavior of Han Chinese in other part of China towards Uyghurs? Like, do they consider them as a citizen of China, or do they give them same amount of respect which they would be giving to another Han Chinese, or like, or it's otherwise?
I think it's otherwise. I interviewed some people a few months ago here in Beijing about Xinjiang, just random people on the street, and I was surprised to see. Actually, probably it's not that surprising that the government propaganda about Uyghurs is very effective. So the government keeps saying that Uyghurs are dangerous, that they're terrorists, that they're separatists, and we need to have these policies in order to transform their minds, to eradicate the ideological viruses. So a lot of Han Chinese, I would say, are supporters of these policies, and they see it as a necessary evil that has to happen. Like, yeah, it's too bad for the Uyghurs, but it has to happen because otherwise, like, I won't be safe. And actually, I heard a lot of people. This was like last fall, before the coronavirus, when travel was now restricted. That there were people, Han Chinese, were saying, well, now I can go to Xinjiang and travel, because before it didn't used to be safe, but now it's safe. So they see it as something that the government does for them.
So how the government has managed to pit 90% of the population against so-called minorities who are so less in number if compared to other people, the rest of the population. How propaganda have been driven by China? Is it the same old school way, the theaters, pamphlets, or something new which is happening after 2009? Media is
It's a
something.
lot of state media. Yes, the CCTV and other like state broadcasters and newspapers, they all repeat the same message,
which they have been
so it's
given from,
it's pretty, sorry,
which they might have been given from people who are up.
yes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the role of media in China, the official role of Chinese media is to be the mouthpiece of the government. Okay. So that's what they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to be independent or critical or any of that.
Yeah, I understand. So yeah, that's a lot. So before we wrap up, do you want to say anything about some good points about Chinese government? Anything? Did they do something good in China? Apart,
Oh God,
they did bring a lot of business
apart from Xinjiang, outside of Xinjiang.
outside of Xinjiang. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I mean, of course, you can't say that everything they do is bad because it's not. I mean, you can look at the coronavirus situation, and even though a lot of, I mean, a lot of people criticize their initial crackdown on the whistleblowers that like tried that wanted to sound the alarm over the coronavirus. They've actually done quite well afterwards. Like I live in Beijing, and it's probably one of the safest capitals in the world right now. Uh, the outbreak has been contained. Like we can have pretty normal lives here,
So
and
yeah,
yeah.
this thought came like this thought came in my mind that Chinese government, they work better when they consider that everyone is equal, everyone is Han Chinese, everyone do not believe in any sort of god or something. They believe in the Communist Party. That's how. Do you think if Uyghurs believe in this thing and they kind of hypothetically forget their god, forget their culture, become Han Chinese, and follow what Communist Party is saying? Do you think Xinjiang would change in a good way, a prosperous way, that business would flow in? Do you think this can happen? It's hypothetical, but do you think?
uh no, I mean, I think people, had I've asked like people from Xinjiang about like how they see like the efficiency of these policies, right? Like can they work? Like okay, they're doing all these things, and they're creating so much trauma. They're like traumatizing generations of people. What will be the outcome of this? And I think for young children who are being raised separated from their parents, like first they'll be like traumatized adults, but maybe they'll be functional uh Han Chinese like citizens, right?
This,
But for yeah, but for people who are already adults, you cannot like the Chinese government thinks that you can brainwash people, like change their minds once they are already fully formed adults, and that doesn't really happen. Like I remember I was interviewing one ethnic Kazakh who was put in a camp for no good reason and was tortured and beaten and so on and so forth. And then he was released, and he crossed into Kazakhstan because he knew he could get citizenship there. And he said when I asked him like how effective do you think these policies are, and he said, and let me tell you a story. When I crossed the border, I I spent the night at a hotel in Kazakhstan, and at this hotel I saw two Han Chinese people, and I just started beating them. He said like he just saw them and he just started punching them until like police intervened. So it's like that's how much hatred he has accumulated against Han Chinese and the Chinese government, etc. That wasn't there. He said he lived his whole life in Xinjiang and he got along perfectly well with everyone.
yeah.
So these people are not going to be good Han Chinese. They're going to be broken individuals. And I mean, I think ethnic identity and cultural identity is important, and like you can't have someone tell you that it's not good to be who you are. Right? That doesn't lead to anything
Yeah,
good.
completely
And
agree.
maybe like 50 years from now there will be a more prosperous uh, economically prosperous Xinjiang. I don't know, but there will be no Uyghur culture,
But
and yeah, that will be extinct if
so
the plan works.
so before, yeah. So you said like 50 years down the line there would be a prosperous Xinjiang would be one of the prosperous province in China, and there would be a
Maybe.
lot. Maybe I hope it should be a prosperous everything. So a lot of business would be there, but Uyghur culture would not be there. So how the diaspora of Uyghurs or world media, world leaders, what's their attitude toward Uyghurs? I know Middle East is completely off. They don't they don't
Yeah,
even
yeah.
want to
They
have any
don't say
say in
anything.
it. They don't want to have any say in Uyghurs life. So like, what do you think?
That's
What's
because they have economic ties with China, so they don't want to endanger
Yeah,
those.
completely agreed.
I think the Uyghurs abroad are very brave, the ones who speak out, because basically us as journalists, the only people we can speak to in terms of Uyghurs, it's the Uyghurs abroad, because we can't, like I told you, we can't go and speak to people on the street in Xinjiang. So the people who do speak out about what's happening inside Xinjiang risk having their families detained, like back in Xinjiang, and they place themselves and their loved ones at great risk in order to communicate this message. But I think it's really strange how hard it is for the world to show more sympathy for the Uyghurs. And we've been covering this issue for years now, for 3-4 years, and there's still a lot of people who don't know who the Uyghurs are, who don't know what's happening, who don't seem to care as much as they might care about Hong Kong protests or stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
I covered Hong Kong and Xinjiang last year, and I saw way more interest in Hong Kong stories than in Xinjiang stories. And the situation was way graver in Xinjiang back then. So
yeah, Hong Kong situation is kind of another podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, before we wrap up, thanks a lot. I would say to you that you came on the podcast. You gave me your time. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I learned a lot. I learned a lot from you, and I hope people who might be watching it, they learn. Yeah, they should learn a lot, and they should know about Uyghurs, their culture, their existence, because the way you said, like 50 years down the line, there would be a prosperous Indian province, but there won't be a Uyghur culture. So thank you for coming, Simina. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for your interest.
Thank you.
So my colleague and I travelled to Xinjiang as travel bloggers in the hopes we'd slip under the radar and get to speak with Uyghur people still living here. We snuck in with hidden cameras. Most of what we captured was filmed secretly.
Yeah. Just walking down the street, there's so many different groups of police walking along with their body armour and their shields and some pretty serious equipment.
I think I'm going to have to be careful now.
There are checkpoints every few hundred yards. Even entering this small bazaar, your bags go through airport-type security and your bodies and faces are scanned. It's Uyghurs who are stopped, and so far, everyone we've met seems to think I'm Uyghur. Uyghur people look different to the Han Chinese, who make up over 90% of China's population. Instead, Uyghurs are ethnically Turkic Muslims with close ties to Central Asia. The world's most sophisticated surveillance technology is being implemented here with meticulous diligence. Among the hundreds of flashing lights suspended from the ceiling are rows of surveillance cameras, literally every 2 meters. I counted at least 40 just in this small room, watching over every conversation,